Hi guys, Olive here. Happy Halloween. Here today to talk to you about the books I read in October 2020. I'm making this wrap-up video a touch earlier than I normally do, and that's because Nonfiction November starts tomorrow. In case you didn't know, I dedicate this whole channel to nonfiction during the month of November. I only read nonfiction and I only talk nonfiction. And I definitely wanted to have a chance to talk to you about some of the books I read in October before that starts, because it includes some fiction. So without any further ado, let's talk books. First of all, even though I had a million different things going on during the month of October, I couldn't resist joining in on the Victober fun. Katie from Books and Things, Kate Howe, and Lucy the Reader do such an amazing job with the Victober challenge. They keep the enthusiasm for Victorian literature going the entire month long, and I really wanted to join in and show them some support. So I decided, even though I had other books on my docket, to pick up two stragglers from earlier in the year that fit the theme. The first of those two was The Victorian and the Romantic by Nell Stevens, which is one of those memoir / admiration for a literary figure mixtures that I love so much. The author of this book decided that she was going to write about Elizabeth Gaskell for her PhD, and not just about Elizabeth Gaskell, but specifically about the time she spent in Rome when she was in the society of a number of other learned individuals, including the American critic Charles Eliot Norton, who she basically fell in love with. Stevens related to that ill-fated love affair. Elizabeth Gaskell was married at the time, because Stevens herself was in love with an American man while she was pursuing her graduate studies. In this book, the author tells Elizabeth Gaskell's story of escaping to Rome for a period of time and feeling so alive when she was there, really feeling like herself. And then simultaneously, the author is telling her own story of being completely infatuated with this American man. In the sections where the author is telling her own story, I really liked when she was talking about being a participant in various different scientific studies. She volunteered herself as a kind of test subject to earn money to buy herself plane tickets to go visit this American boyfriend. But I really liked how, and I'm sure the author knew what she was doing when she did this, I liked how it served as just another way that she and Mrs. Gaskell were kind of mirror images of one another across time, because she's busy studying Elizabeth Gaskell for her PhD while she herself is being studied. Very clever. But there was some sort of something missing from this book that kept it from being the full 5-star read that I thought it was going to be for me. I haven't been able to put my finger on precisely what I mean by that. I think it was lacking some depth that I would have really liked to see from it. Not in the Mrs. Gaskell sections. I actually thought those were really great. I think it was the author sections that just felt a little bit lacking for me. I think I was waiting for it to become about something more than just agonizing over a long-distance love affair. And that never really happened. But still, it's a really decent book overall. And then I also picked up a book by Mrs. Gaskell herself. I read Mary Barton because this was the novel of hers that I wanted to get to this year. This is actually Elizabeth Gaskell's first novel. It is set in Manchester. And although we meet a number of different characters, we mainly focus on members of two different families, the Bartons and the Wilsons. The central conflict is that Jem Wilson is in love with Mary Barton, but she has her eyes on the mill owner's son. Well, that mill owner's son ends up murdered, and Jem Wilson is accused of the murder because of the situation with Mary Barton. This book is actually discussed in The Victorian and the Romantic. It's mentioned in that book that Charles Dickens praised this book, which of course made Elizabeth Gaskell feel wonderful. But now that I've read this book, I can see why he liked it, because it starts bleak and gets bleaker, exactly his kind of thing. I didn't really care for this one, to be completely honest. I think it reads like a first novel, which I can't exactly fault her for, but I think it's far longer than it needed to be. It was really interesting, however, to see that this book was laying some of the groundwork that she would explore more in North and South, like the differences between classes in the north of England, and also the ongoing theme she has of misunderstandings between people. She really likes to play with those. I definitely saw her start to experiment with that in this book, so it was interesting in that way. I've already pretty much come to the conclusion that, unfortunately, I don't think I'm going to love any of the rest of her novels as much as I loved North and South and Wives and Daughters. And I am okay with that. I am still going to go back and read all of the rest of her stuff. I really want to read everything she's ever written. But as long as I go in with the expectation that those two will always be my favorites from her, I think I will make life a whole lot easier on myself. But now on to a less depressing book that I read during the month of October. I wanted to keep up my pace of reading at least one romance book per month. I know I'm not going to get to one during November since I'll be focusing on nonfiction, so I wanted to make sure I got to one in October. I decided to pick up a new release called Spoiler Alert by Olivia Dade. This is about a fan of a Game of Thrones meets the ancient classics style television show and one of that show's stars who both unknowingly write for the same fan fiction site. April is a geologist who absolutely loves this show. She actually cosplays as her favorite character in her free time. And Marcus is one of this show's biggest stars. He pretends to be an airhead in public to kind of promote his pretty boy image, but he is secretly very intelligent. And he also secretly hates the way the showrunners are handling the source material. So for that reason, he writes fan fiction. April writes fan fiction just because she loves the show, and these two actually become friends using their secret online identities. They don't actually know who the other person is in real life. But after April posts a picture of herself cosplaying her favorite character to social media in order to enter some kind of a cosplay competition, a bunch of trolls get on her case because of her weight. Marcus comes to her defense on social media, having no idea that this is in fact his longtime internet friend. He actually asks her out on a date to stick it to the trolls. And it's a romance book. You can see where it goes from there. I really like this book overall. I just really didn't enjoy how similar the central TV show was to Game of Thrones. I thought it was really unoriginal. I mean, the similarities in the way that the final seasons go down in those two shows was so blatantly obvious that it was somewhat cringy. This was a lot of fun. It's very cleverly written. I just wish that central TV show could have been a little something more than such an obvious Game of Thrones clone. In the spirit of October, I also finally read Frankenstein by Mary Shelley, the original 1818 edition. I thought this was so brilliant and so heartbreaking. It is definitely not a horror book as pop culture has always casted it. I gave more of my feelings about this book and specifically about Frankenstein's monster, what I thought of him, in a video I did that looks at the Wishbone adaptation of this book. It was an interesting adaptation, to say the least. So if you're interested in seeing that, I will put a link to that video in the cards and in the description box below. Now, the rest of the books I picked up in October were either new releases or at least relatively new releases, as in they came out in 2020. Against my better judgment, I decided to follow through on my plan to pick up Where Dreams Descend by Janella Angeles. This is the start of a YA duology, and it is kind of the Night Circus meets A Darker Shade of Magic. It stars a girl named Kalia. She is a magician, and she escapes from her mysterious, controlling, club-owning captor in order to run off to a haunted city hosting a magical competition. One of the judges is a former magician himself. Something weird happened with his assistant back in the day, and he becomes a kind of love interest for Kalia. The rest of the judges hate her because they think she's a loose cannon who doesn't follow the rules, which both of those things are true. And then the other competitors start disappearing. All of that, everything I just described, is basically this entire book. It's exactly as I feared. It's all questions and no answers, and felt like half of a book. It felt like the same thing kept happening over and over again. It felt like the author was stalling for time in order to justify splitting one book's worth of story into two books. And this is the part where I need your advice, because I like YA books. I like picking them up on occasion. I think they're a lot of fun. I've read a lot of YA that I've really enjoyed. I don't read it all the time, but I do read it sometimes. But if this is the new normal in the YA sphere, where it's just one story, one book's worth of story split into multiple books solely to make more money out of a really enthusiastic audience, I don't think I can support it anymore. I don't know if I can pick up one more book that reads like this, where it feels like I've ordered a sofa but received an armchair. Like, you've gotten the gist of it, but wasn't there supposed to be more of it? I promise you, I am capable of loving YA books. It's not some sort of mental block that prevents me from liking them. I reviewed 2 great YA books earlier this year. I'm a longtime fan of Marie Rutkotsky's The Winners trilogy, But that's the kind of YA that I want to read, where it's justified in being a trilogy and those cliffhangers actually need to be there. I guess I need some recommendations from you. If you know of any good YA series that are much more like the Winners trilogy than this one, I would love to know about them. I would love to put them on my radar. And also let me know, do you notice the same trend? Is this just how YA is being written now? Anyway, I had a much better experience with The Organ Thieves by Chip Jones. This is a nonfiction book that tells the story of how, in 1968, a Black man was admitted to a research hospital in Virginia with a head injury. Well, within hours, he was declared brain dead, and before his family could be contacted, his heart and his kidneys were removed and transplanted into a white man. The main issue that I had with this book, that I noticed a lot of other reviewers had with this book as well, unfortunately starts right away. You will notice it right away. It's the volume of background information that he provides. He talks a lot about the history of how cadavers were obtained for use by the medical fields. It's not that it's uninteresting information. It's not even that it's unrelated information. It's that it goes on for far too long. A lot of it could have been cut out. And I think if he would have touched back upon the central story, talked about how it was related to our story, I think it would have been a lot better. I know I felt this way. I saw other reviewers talk about how they felt this way. It felt like for a portion of the book, you might have been reading the wrong book because it's not talking at all about the story that's advertised. When we finally do get to that central story, the book gets a whole lot better. It is well researched. It is well presented. The information is shocking, but the author resists the urge to sensationalize anything. He mainly just wants to show the situation for what it was, in a world not all that long ago in which ethics in medicine were disgustingly low. I think if you enjoyed The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks and you want to read another book that's kind of similar, that this is a logical choice to move on to. It's certainly a very important story to be aware of. Just also be aware of that big chunk of background information at the beginning. I seem to be going back and forth between books I liked and books I didn't like in this wrap up, because the next new release I picked up is one I did not get along with very well. I picked it up because I love Maybe You Should Talk to Someone by Lori Gottlieb so much. It's Group by Christy Tate. This is basically the author's history of her experience in group therapy sessions. She started going when she was in law school. She was having a very stressful time. She was at the top of her class, but she was having very dark thoughts. So she decided to seek help. She starts attending a session led by this one therapist that she sees throughout the rest of the book. His name is Dr. Rosen. No idea if that's his real name or not. But in my personal opinion, take that for whatever it's worth, I think this man employs some highly unusual and ethically questionable methods. He insists that secrets are toxic. You're not allowed to keep anything from him, anything from the group. The therapy seekers in this book and all of the sessions that we get to sit in on with Christy, I think she's in 3 different sessions by the end of the book. They all give this man so much control over their lives that it is downright creepy, borderline cult-like. If I hadn't already told you that I didn't enjoy this book, you would probably be getting that same message from my tone right now and my body language, I'm sure. But I just didn't like much of anything about it. I'm happy she went to go seek therapy, but it's just weird. It's cringy. It makes me feel icky. There's a gratuitous amount of sexual content, and the way this therapist does things is just so weird. I personally do not agree that things you keep to yourself, things you decide to keep private, should be labeled as secrets and you should be shamed for not sharing them with the group. And while I certainly feel that a therapist can be involved in making a big life-changing decision, I think it's totally normal that you would consult your therapist about something like that. Like if you're choosing between 2 different jobs, for instance, as the author did in this book at one point. I think that therapist giving you their opinion, maybe helping you make a pro-con list, all of that is totally normal. What I think is less normal is when the therapist tells you which one you should take, and that job is the higher paying one. And then the therapist goes on to encourage you to join more group therapy sessions that are rather pricey. That is suspect. And to top it all off, I also discovered some pretty concerning background information about this author as well. All of that's in my Goodreads review if you want to check it out. It's a no from me. A hard no. And this book was just selected as Reese Witherspoon's next book club pick. Very interested to see how that's going to go down. I moved on to read a new novel that I actually really enjoyed. It's called Pale Morning Light with Violet Swan by Deborah Reed. This is about a famous and also famously tight-lipped abstract painter. She's in her 90s when we first meet her, just after a fairly substantial earthquake shakes her West Oregon town. It's almost like that earthquake shook loose some cobwebs because Violet, who we learn right away is dying from cancer, starts recalling some of her long hidden past, burdens that she's carried around for many years, and she eventually decides that since she's dying, she's going to finally reveal her secrets in a documentary that her filmmaker grandson has been encouraging her to make for years. For the most part, I really liked this book. I particularly liked Violet's sections, whether they were in the past or in the present, because you can tell she's an artist. The whole world is vibrant and colorful to her, and the language reflects that. I highlighted so many passages within her sections because they were so vivid and so gorgeous. The other sections where we're hearing from other members of Violet's family don't use that kind of language because none of them are artists. And so while those sections are fine, they're effective, they seem muted in comparison. And also, we don't get to hear much about Violet's actual painting until a long way into the book. In fact, most of the advertised synopsis, like the one I just gave you, doesn't start until you're 70% of the way into the book. Like the Victorian and the Romantic that I discussed at the beginning of this wrap-up, I think it needed a little extra oomph if it was going to be a full 5-star read for me. But still, I thought it was really good. I thought it was one of those quietly powerful books that I love so much. In fact, I think if you like Lily King, like you liked her latest release, Writers and Lovers, you might really enjoy this one as well. Okay, now, as much as I didn't like Group by Christy Tate, we already discussed that, I have to say I liked They Never Learn by Lane Fargo even less. This is about a murderous English professor who has to dodge an ongoing investigation into her previous crimes as she is actively planning her next murder. I hated this book, but not even in a ragey way. It didn't make me mad. It's just I didn't like a single thing about it. The opening scene is a murder scene, and it's written entirely without tension. I don't know how you make a murder scene boring, but this author achieved it, and that writing style continues throughout the entire book. The twist was completely obvious, and I just personally don't want to feel that an author is asking me to root for a murderer. That is what was happening here. I don't care what a person's motives are. You're never going to convince me to applaud a cold-blooded first-degree murderer. Nobody has the right to take somebody else's life, and that's just kind of how I feel about that. So this wasn't a good experience. And then the final book I read during the month of October is one I want to just quickly mention. It's Tana French's latest release, The Searcher. This is all about a retired American detective who moves to rural Ireland to get away from it all, only to get caught up in the mystery of a missing teenager. I liked parts of this book. I think it needed some help editing-wise that it didn't ultimately receive. If you'd like to hear more of my thoughts on this book, I did a whole video review here on my channel that I will link for you up in the cards and in the description box below. So those were the books of October. I would love to hear from you if you've read any of these books, if you've heard of any of these books, or if you would like to read any of them after you've heard me talk about them. You can put that, any other more general comments or questions, or any YA recommendations down in the comment section below. But if you would prefer to find me somewhere other than YouTube, I am on a variety of different places on social media, and the links to all of my profiles will be in the description box below. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you're having a wonderful day, and I will see you in the next video. Bye.